Hi, and welcome to another episode of Mr. Ford's Guide to the A+ Certification Exam, How to Be a Computer Technician. In this episode, we take a look at processing components. Hey, and welcome back. In this video, we're going to take a look at different things about processing. What is processing? What are some components that we run into with processing? Keep in mind, once again, we're going to look at each of what we're going to talk about. For example, I'm going to talk about CPUs and motherboards. We're going to look at each of these in their own series of videos. This is just to introduce the topic. Also, if you enjoy these videos and this is helping you in your studies, please consider donating $2 a month. Links are down below, and it can really help support this channel. Considering that most of the textbooks out there for A+ start at $30 to $40, $2 a month, even if you'd pay it for an entire year, is still a lot less than one textbook. So enough of that, let's get going. And understand first, when we talk about processing, that before there were keyboards, before we had monitors, before we had a mouse, before we had a printer, there was processing. In fact, one of the earliest computers, one of the earliest possible personal computers, and it's arguable, was something called the Altair. And the Altair was basically a box with a bunch of switches in the front. And people would flip the switches and do different things, and they would get different light output from these little diodes. There was no video output on a monitor, there was no printer output, but the box was still a computer because it still processed information. And ultimately, at the end of the day, that's what a computer is. It's something that's able to process information. It's able to take in raw data and basically make sense of it. Now, one of the things I like to do is when I talk about processing, I like to relate to the nervous system. I teach anatomy and physiology for the college, so this is a natural fit for me. Our brains, our brains process data from the body via the nervous system. It's going to take signals in from all around your body as data. So for example, are you hungry? Are you happy? Are you sad? Do you have a mosquito biting your toe? What's going on? And it's going to get that information to the brain. Now, just like our nervous system, the brain doesn't work by itself. There are other pathways to get to the brain. I want you to keep this in mind. The brain doesn't work just by itself. You have a whole bunch of nerves going off the brain into different parts of the body. When we take a closer look at the motherboard, you're going to notice that the motherboard has a series of nerves all throughout the motherboard. Now, we don't call these things nerves, obviously. We'll talk about what those are technically later. But it's a series of wires that allow signals to be sent from different components of the motherboard to the CPU. So again, just like the human body, we have nerves all around our body to gather information, send it back to our brain, which would be the CPU. It processes that information and then sends that information out. So the motherboard, the computer, works very similar as far as a model goes because it's receiving information and sending information out. The primary processor is known as the central processing unit, otherwise known as a CPU. Here is an example of a CPU, a relatively old CPU, but you can see it. And this is the CPU. And there lies the computer's brain. You can see all those little copper connections down the bottom. Okay, all these little either copper or gold connections. These are going to send information into and out of the CPU there. The primary processor, like I said, is the CPU. There could be more than one CPU. In the old days, we had one CPU. Now we can have multiple CPUs. In fact, if you have a smartphone, you probably have multiple CPUs built in onto that smartphone. It allows it to process more than one stream of information at a time. There are also structures to help the CPU do their job. Now, what's interesting is your brain, your nervous system, works by a series of inputs. Either a signal is sent or a signal is not sent. Either a chemical electrical signal is fired or it's not fired. In the world of computers, it's again the same format as far as either a signal is sent or not sent. Now, obviously, it's not using bioelectrical stuff here. It's using electricity. So either an electrical signal is sent or it's not sent. So it's either off or on. Now, in the human body, we call this all or none. In the world of computers, we call it binary. So if you've ever heard the term binary, now you understand what we're talking about here. There are two main companies that produce CPUs. You have AMD, which is Advanced Micro Devices, and you have Intel. Now, most consumers are familiar with Intel. Intel had and continues to have a pretty good marketing strategy. They're the ones who did that dun 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 dun. They also did the other one of our rock stars are different than your rock stars kind of a thing. But Intel, in fact, right now they're running advertisement with Sheldon from Big Bang Theory about their new Intel chip. So Intel is very good at commercials and marketing, so people are very familiar with Intel chips. AMD doesn't really market as much, I would say, but those of us in the computer world are very familiar with AMDs. And for years, they would go back and forth as far as who was the better processor. Sometimes Intel was ahead, sometimes AMD was ahead. And again, they would go back and forth, back and forth. For a consumer, what this means is that AMD is not a knockoff brand. AMD is not a generic, you can't afford an Intel, get an AMD brand. AMD produces very good CPUs. In fact, again, sometimes, depending on what was going on, who had the better technology, you might have wanted to go AMD, or you might want to go Intel. So those, again, are the two major manufacturers of the processors. Now, there's another type of processor, and this one is called a GPU, and I'm going to leave it in connected to the motherboard that we'll talk about in a second. As games became more advanced, as we wanted better and better graphics in our video games, the CPU really couldn't handle it on its own. Yes, you can get CPUs that'll handle video. In fact, we find that a lot with laptops and lower-end computers where the CPU will manage the video. But if you want to be a gamer, you want a separate video card. And the reason why you want a separate video card is because a separate video card has what we call a graphics processing unit. Okay, and so here is a motherboard. Let me try to get this in frame here. This is a motherboard. Again, it's an older one. And this thing sticking here is a video card. Again, it's an older video card. But you can see right here, see this black stuff right here? This is a heat sink. This pulls heat because underneath this heat sink is the graphics processing unit, the GPU. The GPU is going to handle the video so the CPU can focus on other things. Now, if you were to buy a brand new video card, you're going to see that they are quite extravagant. I mean, they have little fans on them. I mean, they can be very, 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 very powerful because video games have become much more demanding on what you ask for them. So that would be a graphics processing unit, GPU. Then we have a motherboard. The reason why, and here's the motherboard, the reason why it's called a motherboard is because everything, and I mean everything, ultimately connects to the motherboard. So even your keyboard, for example, connects to the motherboard. Now this is an older, let me find the ports here. This is an older motherboard. And so this older motherboard would use this connection here and here for your keyboard and your mouse. And then as they became more advanced, we started using USBs. For example, I'm working on an iMac, and so I'm using Bluetooth on mine. And so it doesn't have a port like this. So even if you're connecting something to the outside of the computer, it's still ultimately, again, connecting to the motherboard itself. If you take a look at a motherboard, you're going to notice that there's a lot of wires and lines written in there. It's because the motherboard is what we call a printed circuit board. Those little circuits, those little lines, are just like the nerves of the body. They're sending information to and bringing information out of the CPU. So again, we're going to take a look at all these components in much more detail in their own respective chapters. And that is it for processing. In our next video, we're going to take a look at storage. So tune in for video 2.3 when we look at storage devices.